Hello. So today I'll be flipping through the 2.5 sketchbooks that I filled up with drawings and paintings while studying stone architecture in Ireland and the UK. All of the drawings in these sketchbooks were done on site, and each one attempts to observe a specific aspect of my project narrative. I have one large sketchbook where I put my paintings, and then a smaller sketchbook mainly intended for ink drawings. I'll be starting with my paintings book, which began in Galway Harbour, perhaps one of the most well-known parts of the famous Irish city. I had just arrived in Galway this day, and during the 4 hours or so it took to complete this massive full-spread drawing, I was fascinated by the decrepit limestone walls that elevated the city streets above the water. So, if you'll pardon the metaphor, the city's foundation is quite literally exposed stone. And so I was surprised to see the combination of both modernized stone buildings adjacent to older historical stone structures, such as the Spanish Arch, which is on the immediate right of the centerfold. Like any tourist visiting Western Ireland, I got the obligatory visit to the Cliffs of Moher out of the way very quickly. As packed as it was, I was able to escape the crowds pretty rapidly and enjoyed a lovely sunny hike, sketching the beautiful rock formations of the Irish Burn. However, the next day I got to experience even more of the rocky Irish landscape as I took a ferry to visit my relatives on Inishmore, the largest of the Aran Islands. This was hands down one of my favorite locations of the trip. Besides getting to meet charming family members for the first time, I was blown away by the hundreds of stone structures on the island. In this particular painting, I tried to illustrate the seamless transition between the man-made structure and natural geology in the cliffside corner of Dunningus, which is a dry stone construction fort built by the Celts 3,000 years ago. It was the oldest structure that I visited on my trip. Besides the numerous ancient forts on Inishmore, I was also enthralled by the more recent residential stone cottages that were oftentimes left abandoned next to a new dwelling and becoming repurposed as tool sheds, or even in some cases, pockets for dumpsters, which I thought was pretty crazy. I cannot talk about Inishmore without mentioning the stone walls. Despite being only 11 miles long, the island has a total of 1,500 miles of dry stone walls that residents have created throughout the years to divvy up land. It's a visible testament to the labor of these Irish residents and their practical use of the natural landscape. As I finished up my day on Inishmore, I sat on a street-side stone wall and drew this abandoned B&B, of which I couldn't find any information on. But the whitewash of the stone walls was eroding off, and vines were slowly working their way over the entire structure. The next day, after spending more time on the island, I got back to Galway pretty late, and so painted this street along the River Corrib at the sunset. Although I left Galway 2 days later, I stayed in Western Ireland for the remainder of the week, as I had more relatives to visit in the town of Claremorris in County Mayo. On the way to Claremorris, I spent more time inside Menlo Castle, which is a massive ruin that I depicted with ink on the right page. After entering into its overgrown interior, I was surprised to notice recently installed I-beams and steel rods that were propping up cavities in the stone walls, which seemed odd for a place missing a roof and covered in grasses, lichen, and flocks of birds. Later on, while in Mayo, I visited St. Mary's Abbey and Ballinasmalla, which is pictured left. Despite being only a couple hours away from the Aran Islands and the Burn, the rocks of the structure and the landscape, consequently, look completely different, with softer edges and with less rectilinear form. I also had the privilege to visit the old cottage where my ancestors used to live in Claremorris. After exploring the space and gathering some sketches, I made an isometric chunk drawing of the house, where I tried to showcase as much of the design's details as possible. After leaving Claremorris, I traveled to Dublin, where I visited the peninsula of Howth on my first day. After exploring the peninsula's rocky coast, I painted this cave that I came across to show the fascinating geology and how it sometimes creates its own shelter for seabirds. I took a day trip while in Dublin to visit Trim, which is a town in the countryside that is entirely situated around the Trim Historic Trail, which is a walkway that takes you through a series of monumental stone ruins. I honestly could have spent the whole week doing drawings in this town, but ended up just doing drawings of St. Mary's Abbey Tower, which is the tallest medieval ruin in Ireland, Trim Cathedral, and certain sections of the Trim Castle walls, which were clearly battered down by enemies throughout the years. If you notice the numbers and letters I labeled the previous drawings with, that's because I drew up a quick plan of the Trim Historic Trail, just showing how close all these massive buildings are to each other and how the town kind of revolves around them. The watercolor that spans this page spread depicts a hospital on the banks of the River Boyne, which was significantly more intact than the other ruins due to its compact rooms and hallways. A couple days later, I traveled north into Belfast, which is the largest city in Northern Ireland, where I got to see some of the most famous Romanesque buildings in the country, such as the massive St. Anne's Cathedral. This is one of the first buildings I drew on the trip that uses sandstone that was not locally sourced. Later during my stay in Belfast, I took a trip to Antrim Castle Gardens, a park that uses the remnants of Antrim Castle as a means of landscape design, which I thought was really cool. On my last full day in Belfast, I visited Belfast Castle, which is a massive sandstone country house that overlooks the entire city. Although it has a Scottish baronial style, the castle is made of pink Scrabo sandstone, which is a very rare material that I was lucky enough to come across while in Howth. The following day, I made my way to the Causeway Coast, where I spent the next few days exploring the dozens of stone ruins along Ireland's northern coastline. This first ink drawing depicts Kinbane Castle, which is a corroded ruin that was once an extensive fortress. I'm going to skip ahead here a bit. I came back to this castle a few days later so that I could better capture a very important aspect of the structure, which is its color. The Causeway Coast has a mix of igneous black basalt rock and Ulster white limestone. These two kinds of stone react very differently to the testament of time. Black basalt has a much weaker structural capacity and tends to be smoother, therefore being less efficient as a building material. Limestone, on the other hand, naturally forms incredible structures and is durable to weathering. To see the difference between these two materials, we need only look at Dunluce Castle, which, although very similar to Kinbane in design, has almost 70% of its structure remaining. The drawing on the left here shows some of it, but we'll see a wider angle in the other sketchbook. After taking a ferry from Northern Ireland to Campbelltown in Scotland, I arrived in Edinburgh, and although most of my stay there was documented in the smaller ink sketchbook, I did manage to do a couple of paintings in the city as well. The painting on the right here was done atop Calton Hill, a park in central Edinburgh with a collection of stone monuments, each built with a different architectural style. It would have been remiss as an architectural student to go to Edinburgh without visiting the Forth Bridge, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site with a double cantilever of 1,700 feet. To paint it, I visited the lovely fishing village of North Queensferry, which was quite literally in the shadow of the massive structure. A few days later, I was on my next stop in Scotland, which was the granite city of Aberdeen. Immediately after leaving the train station, I was taken aback by how the entire streetscape had an almost black and white desaturated look, as granite is such a beautifully colorless material. As the sun came out later, the only real color in the relatively empty city was the blue sky. While in the Aberdeen area, I visited 3 different castles, quote-unquote, although I learned very quickly that the term castle is a bit of a blanket statement. For example, this painting on the left depicts Knock Castle, which is really just the tower house of an old Scottish lord in Cairngorms National Park. The ink paintings on the right are separate structures within the fortress of Donator Castle, a massive fortified village. On a side note here, I loved how certain details of these structures tell us about the structural integrity of old stone architecture. So like, for example, if you look at the smithy here, you'll see that the internal compression of the archway is so strong that it's the only part of the front elevation that's left standing. As I was saying, Donator Castle is more of a walled-in village, and it was absolutely incredible spending the day there and observing all the different ways that the Scottish used the natural landscape as a form of defense. Similarly to some of the castles on the north coast of Ireland, this fortress was placed upon a peninsula with steep cliffs, making it somewhat impenetrable to attackers from all but one side. I also made note of the large amounts of excavation featured on the castle grounds, which was made possible due to the rare geological formation called pudding stone, which, as you can see in this watercolor on the left, is basically small rocks that are naturally cemented together. Finally, the last castle I visited while I was in the Aberdeen area was Slains Castle, which in reality was just a massive Scottish baronial mansion. What makes this castle so interesting is that it was a rebuild of an older structure, and so the current ruins that I visited were only less than 200 years old. So if you look closely, you'll see the remains of rotting wooden beams, as well as the implementation of red clay brick, which we see very often nowadays. While in the city of Aberdeen, I was also able to visit the Brig o' Balgony, which is one of the oldest structures in the region, with an impressive 56-foot tall Gothic arch structure, which also features heavy stone buttresses on the sides to support it. I spent the last week of Scotland in Inverness, which is the largest city in the Scottish Highlands. Although much smaller than Edinburgh and Aberdeen, it is growing rapidly and was definitely somewhat of a tourist attraction due to its central location in the region. The city featured a wide variety of stone construction, and its lack of uniformity was actually very charming, especially after being in uniform cities such as Edinburgh and Aberdeen. One of the first stone structures I visited in the city was Inverness Cathedral, which was incredibly lively and populous as it was a Sunday morning. Interestingly enough, this Gothic building, despite being only 200 years old, closely resembled Elgin Cathedral, a much older ruin that I visited the next day. Elgin's cathedral was built in the 1200s, and yet so much of its design and details were similar to the much more recent Inverness edition. I thought it was very interesting to compare and contrast the two, almost like a before and after image that clearly describes the way in which a building ages. Luckily enough, Elgin's cathedral also had been turned into a museum, and so I was able to find specific and informational details about certain kinds of stone carvings and structural elements in the building. The best day trip of all my travels was my visit to Eilean Dunan, a castle that I have wanted to visit since I was very, very little. This now iconic structure has become a postcard for Scottish tourism, which I think is very interesting as the castle itself has a relatively plain structure. Despite some additions made by the various lords that ruled the castle throughout the Middle Ages, its design is effectively a box. So what that tells me is that it is not so much the architecture of the building that astonishes tourists and visitors, but the surrounding mountains and the intersecting locks that make this scene so memorable. So in other words, it's a building that is kind of tricking people into appreciating the landscape more, which I think is incredible. I was able to visit a working granite and sandstone quarry as well while I was in Inverness, which not only showed me how stones are harvested today, but also allowed for me to observe the natural formations of these rocks before they are harvested. On the same day, I spent a good chunk of time at Urquhart Castle on the banks of Loch Ness, which, similar to the ruins in Trim, were clearly beaten down not by weathering, but by siege artillery. In fact, the drawing on the far right is a close-up of a massive chunk of the main gate that had been blown off. Not only is this now a cool little arch for tourists to pose under, but it's a testament to how sturdy these castle walls were for such a massive piece to remain intact. And then on this next page, here's a wider view of Urquhart Castle. Something that I found profoundly cool was that the gully that borders this castle walls was not made purely for defense, but was actually the excavated area from the rocks used to build the castle. That's perhaps the most locally sourced building I visited during the trip then. I also spent some time just hiking in the Scottish Highlands. So on the right side here was a plein air that I did within an elevated valley that once protected shepherds from attackers. For the final leg of the trip, I flew south down to Bath, which is a Romanesque city about 2 hours west of central London. While I was there, I visited the Roman baths pictured left, which showed me a completely different style of stone construction. Because Bath historically was almost like a resort for the Romano-British, the city shares many similarities to Roman cities in Italy. Also, because it's built on a hot spring, the entire city has a subterranean layer of vaults that once connected to the hot spring water. While I was there, I visited Glastonbury and its Tor, which is an Old English term for hill. The Glastonbury Tor is a strangely steep hill that was created by a massive bubble of igneous rock far below the sedimentary layers. This watchtower atop the hill allows for incredible views of the region. While in Glastonbury, I visited its Abbey grounds, which features the remains of the great church building, the Lady Chapel building, and an assortment of other small stone ruins. Because southern England is more of a temperate zone than the Scottish Highlands, I immediately noticed that the limestone of these structures had decayed much differently. Because rock expands and contracts with wide temperature differences, a lot of the exterior stone blocks of these buildings had cracked and crumbled, while the basic structure of the buildings were maintained. My final painting in Bath depicts Pulteney Bridge, a stone-arched bridge in the city center with 3 separate levels: the commercial street level, the top level where shop owners lived, and a basement level within the arch structure itself. You can actually clearly see the circular windows in the drawing if you look closely. I spent my very last day in Dublin, as my flight home was from there, and so before I left, I visited Glasnevin Cemetery, where I finally was able to draw one of the iconic Irish round towers. However, this one in particular is not inhabitable, but is rather a symbolic structure as a memorial for Daniel O'Connor, who was a leading figure in Ireland's fight for Catholic rights. So that concludes my flip through of the painted book. So now we will move on to the smaller sketchbooks. There were a few observations and ideas that I didn't have time to represent properly on site. Therefore, once I returned from the trip, I decided to use the thousands of photographs I took as reference for a series of small paintings that filled in some of the holes in my narrative. This first painting, depicting Dunluce Castle, was done so as to compare the texture of limestone ruins with black basalt ones like Kinbane Castle. As I mentioned previously, the geology of these two different materials greatly affected the longevity of these ancient structures. The next painting was done in an effort to better convey just how much Dunottar Castle in Aberdeenshire used its site and landscape to its advantage. The majority of the fortress's main defense were the steep rocky cliffs that it sat upon, and so this gate in the painting was one of the only built walls around the castle. This sketched painting on the left depicts a rare kind of stone that I observed in Howth, pink Scrabo sandstone. This painting was significant to me because Belfast Castle was made of that very material, although locally sourced from the Northern Irish coast. The watercolors on the right were done simply to show how the masonry design of ruins affected how flora and vines grew upon it. This dwelling in Northern Ireland was a beautiful example of an old residence integrated with the landscape, quite literally. This farmer from decades ago had used a combination of mud and grass to cover his stone cottage, perhaps as a method of insulation. Now the ruin flows seamlessly out of the hill. This building, while obviously very different in design from our other subjects, was an important example of how stone architecture has adapted to accomplish things that wouldn't have been possible with older methods. The View building in Malahide is supported 15 feet above the water by wooden piles that connect to a foundation of both concrete bricks and fine-cut stone. The color of Slains Castle in Peterhead was something that I found fascinating, but never got to represent fully while I was there. As you might have guessed from the painting, the deep crimson-orange sandstone below the castle walls was the very type of rock used to build the castle, hence its reddish color. This painting was based off of the decrepit walls from Trim Castle, whose decay oftentimes revealed bunkers and vaults below the ground, supported by limestone arches. I also loved that the moat that had once circled this fortress had become infested with marsh grass, and was now a flourishing ecosystem. Finally, this last painting was done to once again juxtapose the geological landscape of the Causeway Coast. It felt pretty surreal to walk through landscapes dominated by bright, pale limestone cliffs, only to turn a corner and be greeted by the darker, volcanic masses of black basalt rock. And that about does it on the post-trip paintings. Thank you for sticking through all the way to the end, and I hope you enjoyed. Take care.